Welcome, my friends, and welcome back to my revisitation of the archaic system called Space Opera. This is Volume 2. Originally, I wish I had the original box that came in. These came as a box set, and then there was a couple character sheet made out of cardstock, and there was a GM, I don't want to call it a screen, but it was a GM aid, and I think that was it. There might have been a stellar map, a star map, a generic star map, but I can't remember. It's been so long ago. The box, pretty much the cover of the box is the same as the cover of Volume 1. A little different, but not much. Volume 2 is typical of these game systems, and I think partly because of the limitations of the printing of the time and cost, they chose to make two separate supplements as opposed to just combining them into one bigger one, which is what they could have done. This is for all intents and purposes, the equipment guide. Probably 70% of the book is dealing with weapons and equipment and gear, stuff that your characters would want or need to succeed in whatever it is they're attempting to do. And the creators try to look at everything considered and used in most of the sci-fi novels and genres and movies and B-movies of the time and include it or some version thereof in here. So we have an extreme amount of material and equipment and gear and neat stuff as far as I'm concerned. And as I look back at these, I hate to say it, but I didn't realize just how heavily, when I created my own game system, like pending Stellar Frontiers, how heavily I tapped into my knowledge of this system. I also used knowledge I'd learned from other game systems and stuff, of course, and stuff I had to come up with on my own because I didn't have any of that information. Most of this, all this stuff was in deep storage at the time, and I did not have access to it. So I can honest to God, say I didn't outright plagiarize it, but there's a lot of similarities, and that's partly because in a game genre you're going to have a lot of similarities. This is where my argument when it comes to fantasy RPGs is that if you've got one, you pretty much have all of them because they're clones of each other. And the argument can be made to the end of the world and you're blue in your face that this game system is much more superior than that game system, or this one is so much different than that one. And I'm just going to nod and shake my head and probably not agree, because if you play in a certain type of genre, that game system is the same game system as everything else. There might be some different approaches to their mechanics and how they get to it. Their verbiage might change. They might try to streamline something or try to enhance something that was not covered well enough in the game system that they enjoyed but wanted better. But in reality, if you've got Dungeons and Dragons, you've got just about every sword and sorcery and hack-a-slash game system available. You just have to change the nuances. And a lot of times the nuances is just the world that they're playing in. Now, like I said, a lot of people come along and they've tried to streamline this system or that system and make them their own. In reality, if you go back and look at the huge variants of these games, you'll find that Dungeons & Dragons at some point or another touched on a lot of that in its history. And it had its streamlined versions. It had its simplistic rule sets. And some things have never changed. It is what it is. And I'm not comparing them. So that's not what I'm here to do. In this particular supplement, the second half of the core book, or the second core book, we got into things like dealing with computer combat, their version of hacking and slashing, which was not quite common at the time, and yet they were, I don't know, wise enough to include the rule sets and some stuff and mechanics in here. They also have a handful of things like cyber enhancements and biowetware, but not to the extent that we would see it in more modern game systems. Here are mini computers, medical supplies, visionary aids. Now, I made a statement in the first one that they actually have something here that kind of puts light on my first statement. The first statement said that, they don't have anything like the potion of healing, which apparently is not necessarily true. They have a medical supplement called TKM, or tankanociclocamine. The drug TKM will arrest decay of all body tissue, including the brain and nervous systems, for a period of up to 24 hours after death. Repeated injections every 24 hours can continue the status effect until the victim is brought to a facility with revival capability. A thoracic adept can produce the same effect in himself through a form of suspended animation. Cigarette mask, blah blah. So basically, you put yourself, your people shoot you up with this stuff, and it arrests your this, so as long as you, they go into a little detail in another section, as long as your brain's intact, they can more or less reconstruct you. Give it time. Now there's the key that you're going to have to spend, your character is going to spend some downtime recuperating, healing from this. There isn't no instant revive like they do in a lot of hack and slash stuff. Sets it apart, which is one of the reasons they emphasize having multiple characters to give your player the opportunity to continue playing, and as long while his other character is in the shop or something, so to speak. Visual aids, communication systems, electronic countermeasures, miscellaneous equipment, thought mask, crime detection assist, crime tech polygraph, truth serum, autopilot, mobile workshop, chainsaw, heavy toolkit, battle armor, spacesuits, and jump belts. I look through this stuff and I can't help but think of some of the early sci-fi books I read over the years. You got the Heimlich Starship Troopers, and the original Buck Rogers, and the original Flash Gordon, and a lot of that stuff is clearly represented here to some degree or another. It's just a matter of the color. Here's the early version of a jump trooper, and they try to cover every possible contingency. And we get into a section. Here's a section of robots. And this is what sets robots in classic sci-fi apart from the droids of the Star Wars era. His robots are cyberneticized machines that will act exactly as programmed and ordered. Robotic prosoponic brains can control a vehicle, a gun, a suit of powered armor, battle or war robot, or even an entire starship. The Mech is the master of the science of robotics, partially because that feline race is rather limited in numbers and must augment itself with semi-sentient cybernetic equipment, blah, blah, blah. So, the main thing here is you don't have self-aware machines, for the most part. At least they've stepped away from it. They've kept closer to the traditional concept of what we imagine robotics would be like in the modern era, which we sadly have yet to really achieve. If you go by what the hopes and the dreams of the science fiction authors of the era of the 40s and 50s were, we are so far woefully behind. It's sad. And the truth was, and I still believe, that we didn't have to be this far behind. We could be in that timeline where we have atomic ships sailing through the solar system and so on and so forth, but we spent more time trying to keep up with the Joneses and to fight wars of non-wars of attrition by staying ahead of everybody else, technologically speaking, instead of getting together as a society and as a world and unite ourselves to better causes. But that's just me. That's that liberalism in my mindset. So it is. Civilian aircraft, civilian vehicles. Now, unlike a lot of game systems, later game systems, Fast's MechWarrior is heavy into vehicles and mechs and stuff. So you have entire source books devoted to the subject. They give you a random selection of basic stuff and leave it up to you once again to fluff it out. So you only, a truck is a truck is a truck. It doesn't matter if it's built by an alien race, by a human race, or by fishmen. If it all works the same concept, it's designed to carry people and equipment and material somewhere and to be used as a utility vehicle. So the appearance, this is up to you, me, and as the GMs to decide, the Star Masters, to decide what their physical appearance are going to look like. Saves on a lot of unnecessary source books in that aspect. Weapons. and they've covered pretty much every concept of weapons: stunners, fusion guns, disruptors, slug guns, tech firearms, shotguns, gauze rifles, recoilless rockets, stat rifle, needle guns, blasters, dart guns, drugs and poison effects for the darts, lasers. The list just keeps going on. Then we get into rules for ground combat, using jump belts in combat, morale, direct fire weapons, penetration, hit location, wounds, humanoid hit areas and non-humanoid areas of body hit, melee penetrations, starship rules for sublight maneuvers, sublight voyage times, warp drive, standard starship designs, FTO voyage times, astrogation, standard designs, stats for equipment. Now, for a moment, one of the earliest attractions to me in the gaming hobby, whether it be fantasy role-playing games or science fiction role-playing games, was the world building, the creative process of conceiving and putting on paper my vision of what this stuff would be. One of those, in that love, a significant cornerstone was the creation of starships and vehicles. I dearly loved to design my own and to envision them as best I could in crude drawings of them to give both an interior and exterior view of what basically would become a very important component of my game. And I couldn't tell you how many hundreds of hours I spent on creating this stuff, and a lot of stuff that never got used, never got utilized, but it's there. Now, in my own game system, I have an entire book on Starship Components. A good chunk of it's Starship Components. It's called the Blueprint Guide, but the rules are there for you to build from scratch your own starship designs. But you basically follow the same formats based on tonnage ratios. A certain class of ship falls with a certain tonnage, and within that tonnage, you have a lot of options as to what kind of tech level equipment and components you use to manufacture your ship, and what it's capable of. So you can have a lot of individual design. So, and I think you see quite a bit of that elements here. Not to the degree that I took it, but it's still here. Life capsule, ship boats, ship marines, warp engines, starship battle screens, battle armor, turn sequence, targeting and selection range, star torp fire, the Nova gun, which is the end all to beat all of space-based weaponry for starships. The Nova Good action. We got our charts for figuring out combat range versus speed, blah blah blah. If you want to go into that level of combat, boarding actions, orbital fortresses, star bases. They give you a little bit of information on that sort of thing. Starship economics and interstellar commerce, financing starship purchases, used ships, starship revenue, operational expenses, bank accounts. There's a style of play you don't see too often, but it's plausible. And this one page gives you all the rules you need to do it. You could create the economics of starship operations. So instead of having a bunch of characters and PCs, if it's just you and one or two other people, they could design starships as the ubiquitous commander or owner or captain, and then apply the space lanes in a form of either exploration and or commerce. So I'm going to try to make money and do my version of civilization using a starship as a character class, as a character, and not the characters themselves. So, other than having a captain's negotiation rule, stats and stuff, so you can negotiate deals and so on and so forth, you really don't need. That's just a different angle potentially you could take it. There's their version of a star chart. I'm fond of this particular style to a certain degree, although it could be a little more complicated for those that are not used to it. Most people are used to a grid system or a box system. It's much harder to envision a three-dimensional space than it is a two-dimensional space. And I've tried to do that in my game system by using three-dimensional box sets. So, and then we got our sets of rules for creating populations and planets, major population centers, the types of governments that you might encounter, planetary trade and commerce, industrial index, major exports and imports, definition of habitable planet, general planetary conditions, length of day, breathable atmospheres, all the stuff you need, NPC races, NPC expertise. And then we got into some bad guys or some generic villains. And it's chapters under chapter 16.3, the bug-eyed monsters. And I believe this, and I hold this true in my own game system and in my novels, that there are just some things humans run across that we just can't get our fingers around. And they just evoke every concept of the terror thing in our mindset, and our first instinct is usually our last instinct to eradicate. However much mankind may come to accommodation with many other diverse races that we'll encounter in the universe, there will always be some that are so starkly alien that no common ground will be found on which to build friendly relations. Such races are the, quote, monsters of the galaxy, in this case, the bugs. And you're quite familiar with Starship Troopers. I don't need to go into any depth in that. The Clacons, which are some version of some kind of crustacean, and the Murtons, which they liken to H.G. Wells' Martians in the War of the Worlds. So kind of like squid-based aquatic whatever. And then we got a section on creating beasts, animals, and personal living expenses, aircraft and rental. So, there you go. Not quite 30 minutes. We did a good job. This is the equipment, the all-to guide. It also, like I said, planetary creation rules are in here. Enhancements for creating races. And once again, nowhere in these do they include a bunch of pre-made stuff. So you'll find some of that in the upcoming supplements as we get to those, but you won't get them in the core book. And the core book set out from the beginning with that in mind. They wanted to give the Star Master the framework needed to create the vision that they have in their own head. And if they want to follow the vision of their favorite game system or novel or book system or TV series or whatever, the mechanics here allow for it, and the visuals are in those. It's just up to us to translate those onto some form of paper that we can then share with the players at the table. So, you know, if the players are quite familiar with Starship Troopers, then it would be real easy to run a campaign in our own version of Starship Troopers. Now, I understand they now have an RPG for that, but before they did, this would have been the set of this series would have been the set to use to create that. Before West End Games came out with Star Wars, this was the rule books I used to play my first initial Star Wars campaign. It was using these books. And my friend had the Traveler series. I'll touch on Traveler just a hair. It's a good system. It's a good system. One of my biggest problems with it is in my head. I was a young man at the time, and I saw all these little what looked like pamphlets. Because my friend's version are these little booklets about yay big, and there's a lot of them, lots of them. So what they're doing is each one represents a chapter of material that would be, you know, in one or two books. If we'd broken these chapters down, I'd have 16 or 20 small booklets. And the idea of having to go out every week and buy the next booklet that came out, it kind of just, it ate at me, and I didn't like the concept. Now, I played Traveler with him. You know, he ran it, and it was a good system, enjoyable. I have no problem with it. You know, and there's a lot of similarities between them. But we're back to that argument. A clone is a clone. You know, hack and slash and fantasy. If you have a D20 system, pretty much you have all the D20 systems. The material in them sets them apart, of course. I'm not having that argument with you. But for the most part, there's only so many variances A sword is a sword is a sword. Fireball is a fireball is a fireball. Wizard's a wizard. Doesn't matter what the setting or how we get there. Same thing goes with science fiction. And like I said, if you could get your hands on one of these, they're awesome things to have. If nothing for the nostalgia factor, reading back and looking at where we came from. And there's a lot of material in these older game systems that you do not see in the newer systems, in part because they were considered too clunky or archaic or outdated or not viable, and they were left behind. Or the wordage and the verbiage changed considerably. So the style of how we approached creating the rules or writing them so they're legible or readable also changes. And so that lends itself to that clunky mindset. It's just my opinion on that subject. The another interesting side note is the timeline when they created these books. This we're talking the countries were coming out of not in the middle of the height of the Cold War, because that was in the 60s. The Cold War is still simmering along, but it's becoming old, and people were envisioning what a world would be like, if mankind developed the ability to get off the planet and get out into space. How much of our politics and our creative differences of our civilizations would carry through. So when we get to the source books, that the star charts, the star books that are part of the source additional source material for the game, you will discover that that carried over. So the former Soviet bloc nations got off and went out into space and created their own stellar empire, taking a lot of their mindset with them. And the same went with the European mercantile bloc of nations, which I find ironic that they always attribute the European, their version of the European Union. They envisioned it 40 odd years ago, 50 years ago, and yet they also put a twist on it, or their own spin on it, to make them sound like a bunch of money grubby capitalists, which you'd think would be more like the American style of what it's not. And then there's the Asiatic blocks that created. So in reality, we have several human empires floating around out there in the game world for space opera, in the one that they envisioned, the creators, and plus in addition to having some alien civilizations and so on and so forth. So, but we'll get to those in time. Thank you for watching.